Everyone knows you don't build where the water comes. A floodplain is the one stretch of ground a sensible person walks away from. It drowns. On a schedule, or with no schedule at all, the river climbs its banks, takes back the land, and everything standing on it goes under. Yet the first great cities on Earth were built in exactly those places, on purpose, by people who understood the risk far better than the story usually allows. Uruk sat on the flat mud of southern Iraq, wedged between two rivers famous for reducing whole towns to rubble. Memphis rose on the Nile floodplain in a valley that disappeared underwater every summer. Mohenjo-daro was laid out on the open plain of the Indus, a river that has since buried the city's own ruins under many feet of silt. The early heartland of China gathered along the Yellow River, a river so lethal it carried a name that translates as China's sorrow. None of these were desperate settlements clinging to bad land. They were the richest, most crowded, most advanced places of their age. Every one of them chose the flood. That is the real puzzle. Not one clever trick that one clever culture pulled off a single time, but the same decision reached independently on separate rivers across continents and across thousands of years. Build the city where it floods. Keep it there. Raise your children there and let them raise theirs. So the question was never whether these people were foolish. They plainly weren't. The question is what they could see up close that we, at a comfortable distance, forget. Here's the short answer, and everything after this is the evidence for it. The flood was not the price they paid to live there. The flood was the whole reason to live there. Start with the ground. A river in flood is a river carrying dirt. It strips soil off distant hills, suspends it in the fast brown water, and the instant that water slows and fans out over flat land, it sets the load down. What settles is silt, a fine, dark, mineral-rich sediment, and it is close to the best natural fertilizer a farmer could ask for. Each flood spread a fresh sheet of it across the fields, free, delivered to the doorstep. No dung to cart in, no long years of leaving land fallow to recover. The river did that labor by itself, once a year, for as long as anyone could remember. Then there is the water, obviously, in a part of the world where rain could not be relied on, and the flat ground the river built. Easy to plow and easy to walk, and the river itself as a road, the fastest way to move grain and stone and people before the engine existed. Put those together and a floodplain stops looking like a hazard. It looks like the one place a large settled population could actually feed itself. Cities need a food surplus before they can exist at all. Somebody has to grow far more than they eat so that other people can become potters and priests and scribes and soldiers. The floodplain was the machine that produced that surplus. The danger and the wealth arrived in the same brown water. Egypt is where this bargain worked most gently, and it is worth watching closely, because the Nile was the kind one. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing roughly 2,500 years ago, called Egypt the gift of the river. He meant it almost literally. Egypt gets next to no rain. Nearly everything the country drank and grew came from one river fed by summer monsoon rains far away in the Ethiopian highlands. Each year in the season the Egyptians named Akhet, the flood arrived. It came with such regularity that they could set a calendar by it, roughly tracking the reappearance of the star Sirius in the sky in midsummer. The water rose, spread across the low fields, sat there, and withdrew, leaving that dark, fertile film behind. The Egyptians even had a word for their own country's soil that meant simply the Black Land. They did not just wait for it, they shaped it. Egyptian farmers built low earth walls to pin the floodwater into basins, held it there for weeks so the silt could settle and the soil could drink, then let it drain and planted into the wet ground. And because everything depended on the size of the flood, they measured it. Along the river, they cut nilometers, staircases, and marked gauges that recorded exactly how high the water climbed each year. Too low meant famine, too high meant destruction. The reading told officials what the harvest would be and therefore what taxes to demand before a single seed went in. Picture the scene at the water's edge. A man walks down worn stone steps at dawn, reads a mark on the wall, and knows from that one number whether the country eats this year. The whole state balanced on the height of a river. There's a detail here most people miss, and it is the reason Egypt lasted the way it did. On other rivers, irrigation slowly poisons the soil. Water sitting in fields evaporates and leaves its salts behind. And after enough years, the ground turns barren and white. The Nile's flood flushed those salts back down out of the root zone every single year and topped the fields off with new soil at the same time. The river was not just watering Egypt, it was constantly repairing it. For thousands of years, that made Egyptian farming both extraordinarily productive and, rarest of all, sustainable. If every river behaved like the Nile, there would be no paradox here at all, but most of them didn't. Move east to the land the Greeks called the country between the rivers, Mesopotamia, Uruk, Eridu, Ur, some of the first true cities anywhere, all planted on the same flat southern plain for the same reason: astonishingly fertile soil, watered by the Tigris and the Euphrates. And here, the bargain turned harsh. These rivers did not flood on a gentle, predictable schedule. They flooded violently at unpredictable heights, and worst of all, at the wrong time. The water peaked in spring, in April and May, just before the grain harvest, when a big flood could destroy an entire year's food in an afternoon, rather than nourish it. One year's flood might carry 10 times the water of another's. Imagine standing grain heavy and nearly ready, a season of work waiting on the stalk, and the river arriving a week early to lay the whole field flat under brown water. The rivers could jump their banks and swallow a town whole. So the people of Mesopotamia did something Egypt barely needed to. They fought the river. They dug canals to pull water off when they wanted it, and drainage ditches to push it away when they didn't. They built embankments and reservoirs. They wrote laws about who maintained which canal and penalties for the farmer whose neglect flooded his neighbor. Water management here was not a seasonal gift to receive. It was a permanent public works program that never stopped, and it came at a slow cost because they irrigated fields that didn't drain well. Salt built up in the soil, exactly the process the Nile avoided. In the 1950s, the scholars Thorkild Jacobson and Robert Adams studied ancient records from southern Iraq and argued that you can actually watch this happening in the texts as farmers over centuries shifted away from wheat toward barley, which tolerates salty ground far better. That reading has been debated since, but the underlying wound is real. Some of the first fields humans ever irrigated were slowly salted to death by the very water that fed them. The rivers here were dangerous enough that they may have marked the culture's oldest stories. The great flood that drowns the world and spares one family in a boat appears in Mesopotamian literature long before it reaches the Bible, and archaeologists have found layers of serious flood deposits in the region, dating back 4,000 to 5,000 years. It is at least plausible that a real catastrophe on these exact rivers became the flood myth so many cultures half remember. Now go further east still, to the river that shows the whole bargain at its most extreme. The Yellow River is the cradle of Chinese civilization, and it is also, by a wide margin, the deadliest river in human history. The reason is a pale, powdery soil called loess. The river runs through a vast plateau of it and picks up a staggering load, so much sediment that in places the water is more than half mud by weight, which makes the Yellow River the muddiest large river on the planet. All that silt is why the surrounding farmland is so rich. It is also a trap. As the river crosses the flat plain near the sea, it slows, drops its mud on its own bed, and the bed rises. So people build levees to hold the river in. The river keeps depositing, the bed keeps climbing, and the levees have to be raised again to match. Do this for centuries, and you get something genuinely strange. A river running above the rooftops of the towns beside it, held up only by walls of earth. In some stretches, the bed sits 30 feet or more over the surrounding country. Stand on one of those dikes on a summer night, and the danger stops being an abstraction. The river is up there above the level of the fields behind you, moving heavy and slow in the dark. And the only thing between all that water and every farm in the valley is the packed earth under your feet. Through the flood season, men walk the embankments in shifts with torches and drums, watching for the first seep of water coming through the wall, because a leak the width of a hand could open into a breach a mile across by morning. When the drums sounded, whole villages turned out into the dark to throw earth and stone, and sometimes the doors off their own houses into the gap. Some nights they closed it, some nights they ran. When one of those walls fails, the river doesn't just overflow, it leaves. It carves an entirely new path to the sea across the crowded plain a violent jump engineers call an avulsion. And it has done this again and again, redrawing the map and drowning enormous numbers of people each time. Chinese officials have recorded somewhere near 1,500 of these floods over roughly the last 2,000 years. The worst of them rank among the deadliest single disasters ever recorded. The flood of 1887 and the flood of 1931 each killed on a scale that is hard to hold in the mind. The first time I read the estimated toll for 1931, a range running from several hundred thousand up toward 4 million, I assumed the higher figure was a typo. It is not a typo. It is how uncertain the counting becomes at that scale. Against a river like that, the entire civilization organized itself around control. Chinese tradition credits the very founding of its first dynasty to a man remembered as Yu the Great, an official who supposedly tamed a world-ending flood, not by damming it, but by dredging channels to guide the water out. Whether Yu existed at all is unknown, and I find it telling that a culture would place a flood controller at the mythical root of the state itself. The message is hard to miss. Here, to rule was to manage the river. Which brings up the one question underneath all of this, the one that is genuinely unsettled. Did the flood make the state? In the 1950s, the historian Karl Wittfogel argued that it did, that any society leaning on huge waterworks for irrigation and flood control was forced to build a centralized, bureaucratic, top-down government to command the labor, and that this is why the great river civilizations tended toward absolute rulers. He called them hydraulic societies. It is a bold, tidy theory, and archaeologists have spent decades poking holes in it. Robert Adams, among others, showed that in Mesopotamia, in China, and in Mexico, full states appear in the record before large-scale irrigation does, which is the reverse of what the theory predicts. The reading I find more convincing sits in the middle. Controlling a great river probably didn't conjure centralized power out of nothing, but it handed power a job that centralization was very good at. And it rewarded whoever could do that job. The river didn't invent the king, it made a strong argument for keeping one. Whatever the politics, look at what these cities physically did, and the intelligence is obvious. Mohenjo-daro on the flooding Indus was raised deliberately above the danger. Excavations there, led in the 1960s by George Dales working with the hydrologist Robert Rakes, uncovered enormous artificial platforms of mud brick, some lifting the city 20 to 40 feet over the plain, with the most important buildings set highest of all. The streets ran covered drains. Nearly every house had its own bathroom connected to the system, waste carried out of the city through brick channels while the family stayed dry, on ground. The builders had lifted by hand, brick by brick, above the reach of the Indus. This was not a people cowering from the water. This was a people who had studied it, measured it, and engineered a city that could live on top of it. What finally ended Mohenjo-daro is still argued over, and the old idea that one great flood or a shifting river killed it has not held up cleanly. But its whole design is a monument to the same choice everyone else made. Take the rich, dangerous ground, and outbuild the danger. So here's the pattern laid bare: four rivers, four peoples who never met, one decision: settle where the water floods, because the flood brings the soil, the water, the flat road, and the surplus. A city is impossible without. Where the flood was gentle, as on the Nile, they received it and grew fat. Where it was savage, as on the Yellow River, they wrestled it their whole history long and buried their dead by the hundreds of thousands, and still would not leave, because leaving meant giving up the richest farmland they had. The flood was never a flaw in the plan they put up with. It was the plan. The water that threatened the city was the same water that made the city possible, and they knew it, and they stayed. We tell ourselves we are smarter now. The evidence is not encouraging. Today, more people than ever live exactly where their ancestors did, on the flat, fertile, dangerous land where big rivers meet the sea. River deltas make up less than 1% of the planet's land surface, and something like 500 million people live on them. Roughly 10 of the world's 30-odd largest cities sit on a delta: Kolkata, Shanghai, Bangkok, Ho Chi Minh City, Dhaka, Alexandria, New Orleans. The reasons haven't changed in 5,000 years. Flat land, fresh water, deep soil, and a river mouth that makes the perfect port. The bargain that built Uruk is the bargain that built modern Asia. But the ancient half of that deal has quietly been broken, and it is starting to show. The old cities survived because the flood kept delivering new silt, constantly rebuilding the land faster than it could sink or wash away. We have stopped that delivery. Upstream, dams and reservoirs and channels now trap the sediment that used to reach the coast. The river runs clear, where it should run brown. At the same time, the cities pump groundwater out from under themselves and press down on the soft ground with their own enormous weight. So the deltas are no longer being topped off. They are sinking. Satellite surveys now show that most of the world's major deltas are dropping in many places faster than the sea itself is rising, which puts hundreds of millions of people on the wrong side of the water. Bangkok, Dhaka, Shanghai, Alexandria, the same great rivermouth cities, are among the fastest sinking. New Orleans learned this the hard way, sitting in its bowl below the level of the water when the storm came. Jakarta has sunk several feet in living memory and floods so badly that Indonesia has begun moving its capital elsewhere. The irony is almost too neat. The ancient cities accepted the flood in order to keep the land. The modern ones rejected the flood, walled it off, dammed it back, and in doing so, are losing the very land the flood used to build. Those old builders made a deal with the river. Their descendants tried to cancel it, and the river is quietly calling in the difference. So think again about that piece of ground a sensible person is supposed to walk away from: the low place by the river that drowns. The people who built the first cities on earth walked toward it with their eyes open and stayed for thousands of years because they understood what it really was. Not a place the water would ruin, a place the water had made.